Picture this, you're standing in your cap and gown at Northwestern Law School graduation, diploma in hand, when your own mother leans over and whispers, "Well, I hope you're proud of that worthless piece of paper. What if I told you that same worthless degree would land me a personal invitation from a Supreme Court justice just 2 years later?" Sometimes the people who doubt you the most are the ones who fear your success the greatest. This story gets darker than you might expect. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The rain was coming down in sheets that May afternoon in Chicago, turning the Northwestern campus into a watercolor painting of blurred edges and muted colors. I should have been celebrating 3 years of law school, countless sleepless nights buried in case law, and a freshly minted Juris Doctor degree. Yet all I could think about was the expression on Patricia's face when I called her mom during my graduation speech. She had flown in from Portland specifically for this moment. At least, that's what I thought. Patricia Hoffman had always been particular about appearances, the kind of woman who coordinated her nail polish to her handbag and never left the house without lipstick perfectly applied. She worked as a paralegal at a small firm for over 20 years, always talking about how she knew the law inside and out, despite never having attended law school herself. Growing up, she would often remind me that formal education was just expensive paper, and that real knowledge came from experience. The ceremony itself had been beautiful. Dean Chandler gave an inspiring speech about our generation of lawyers becoming advocates for justice in an increasingly complex world. When they called my name, Claire Hoffman, magna cum laude, I felt a surge of pride that surprised me with its intensity. I had worked harder than I ever thought possible, often surviving on coffee and determination alone. My constitutional law professor had even recommended my law review article on judicial precedent to several prominent legal journals. Nicole Rivera, my roommate and closest friend throughout law school, was sitting 3 rows behind the family section. She had driven in from her new job in Milwaukee just to be there, wearing a bright yellow dress that stood out like sunshine against the sea of black graduation robes. Nicole knew better than anyone what this moment meant to me. She had been there during the panic attacks before big exams, the nights when I questioned whether I was smart enough to be there, and the constant phone calls from Patricia questioning whether I was wasting my time and money on fancy theories. After the ceremony, families gathered under the white tents that had been set up on the quad. The grass was still damp from the morning rain, and the air smelled like wet earth and fresh flowers from the landscape. I spotted Patricia immediately. She was standing apart from the other families, checking her phone rather than mingling. She wore a navy blue dress that was perfectly appropriate but somehow managed to look disapproving even as clothing. Daniel Torres, my boyfriend of 8 months, reached me first. He had driven down from his residency program in Minneapolis, still wearing his scrubs under a hastily thrown-on jacket. His smile was genuine and warm as he wrapped me in a hug that lifted me off the ground. "Hoffman," he said, using the honorary title that law graduates technically earned. "I'm so proud of you." It was in that moment of joy, surrounded by the chatter of other celebrating families, that Patricia approached. She didn't smile. She didn't congratulate me. Instead, she looked at the diploma in my hands with the same expression she might reserve for spoiled milk. "Well," she said, her voice carrying that particular tone I had learned to dread over the years, "I hope you're proud of that worthless piece of paper. 3 years and $100,000 in debt for what exactly? To argue with people for a living." The words hit me like a physical blow. Around us, other families were taking photos, laughing, sharing champagnetic toasts with plastic cups of champagne, provided by the school. Daniel's hand found mine, squeezing gently in support, but I could see the shock in his eyes. Nicole, who had finally made her way over to our group, stopped mid-stride when she heard Patricia's comment. "Patricia," Daniel said carefully, "this is a huge accomplishment. Claire graduated with honors from one of the top law schools in the country." Patricia's laugh was sharp and cold. "Oh, the boyfriend thinks he knows about the real world. How charming." She turned back to me, her voice dropping to that familiar whisper that somehow felt more cutting than if she had shouted. You could have had a perfectly good life with a practical degree. Teaching, nursing, something useful. Instead, you chose to play dress-up in courtrooms with a bunch of privileged children who think they can change the world with their fancy words. I stood there, diploma trembling in my hands, unable to form a response. This was supposed to be my moment of triumph, the culmination of everything I had worked towards since I was 16 years old, and first watched a Supreme Court argument on C-SPAN. I had dreamed of this day through every difficult semester, every rejection letter from internships, every time someone suggested that maybe law wasn't for people like me. The tent around us seemed to grow quieter, or maybe my hearing was just focusing on the sound of my own heartbeat. Other families continued their celebrations, but I felt isolated in this bubble of humiliation that Patricia had created with surgical precision. "Mom," I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper, "I worked really hard for this." "Hard work," she repeated, as if tasting something bitter. "Claire, I've been working hard my entire life without needing to prove it with expensive degrees. I know more about the legal system than half the lawyers I work with, and I didn't need to go into debt or waste 3 years of my life to learn it." Nicole stepped forward then, her yellow dress bright against the gray afternoon. "Mrs. Hoffman, Claire's professors have been incredibly impressed with her work. She's already had several firms reach out about positions." Patricia's gaze shifted to Nicole with undisguised irritation. "And you are? Nicole Rivera, Claire's friend and study partner. I've watched her excel in ways that I see." Patricia cut her off. "Another one who thinks academic performance translates to real-world success. How naive." The conversation continued around me, but I felt disconnected from it, like I was watching a movie of my own life. Daniel tried again to redirect the conversation towards celebration, suggesting we all go to dinner somewhere nice. Patricia declined, saying she had an early flight back to Portland and needed to return to her hotel. Before leaving, she pulled me aside, away from Daniel and Nicole. Her hand on my arm was firm, not quite painful but insistent. "Claire, I hope you know I'm saying this because I love you. The legal profession is cutthroat, and it's not kind to people who don't understand how the world really works. You've always been idealistic, but that's not going to pay your bills or give you the stability you need." She paused, looking around at the other families still celebrating under the tents. "Look at all these people throwing money around like it grows on trees, acting like their children have accomplished something extraordinary. Most of these graduates will be working at insurance companies or small firms, doing paperwork and dealing with divorces and petty disputes. That's the reality, not whatever fantasy you've built up in your head about being some kind of crusader for justice." I wanted to argue, to point out my grades, my law review publication, the internship offer I had received from a respected firm in Portland. Instead, I found myself nodding, as if agreeing with her assessment of my own achievements. "I just want you to be realistic," she continued. "Your father and I have built a good life with practical choices. The accounting firm is steady, reliable work. Marcus understands that he's studying business because he knows what actually pays the bill. I just don't want to see you disappointed when you realize that all this education hasn't prepared you for how things actually work." After she left, Daniel, Nicole, and I went to a small restaurant near campus. The place was full of other law school graduates and their families, the atmosphere buzzing with excitement and possibility. I picked at my pasta, unable to shake the feeling that Patricia's words carried some truth I was too naive to see. "She's wrong, you know," Nicole said gently, reaching across the table to touch my hand. "Everything she said was wrong." Daniel nodded emphatically. "Claire, you're brilliant. Your professors have told you that, your grades reflect it, and I've seen you work through legal problems that would stump practicing attorneys." I appreciated their support, but Patricia's voice echoed in my head. She had a way of planting seeds of doubt that grew in the quiet moments, making me question everything I thought I knew about myself and my abilities. That night, alone in my apartment while packing up 3 years of law school memories, I found myself wondering if she might be right. Maybe I had been naive to think that academic success would translate to real-world achievement, Maybe I was just another privileged graduate with unrealistic expectations about what my degree could do for me. The job search over the next several weeks seemed to confirm some of Patricia's warnings. The Portland firm that had initially shown interest suddenly went quiet. Other applications disappeared into the void of automated response email. The few interviews I did manage to secure felt stilted and formal, leaving me with the impression that I was missing something crucial about how to present myself in the professional world. During one particularly discouraging week in June, I called Patricia to update her on my job search. I had been hoping that maybe she would offer some encouragement, or perhaps acknowledge that the process was more difficult than either of us had expected. "Well," she said after I described the latest round of rejections, "I hate to say I told you so, but this is exactly what I was worried about. You've spent 3 years learning theory when what employers want is practical experience. Maybe you should consider starting at a paralegal position somewhere, work your way up the way I did." The suggestion stung more than I expected. There was nothing wrong with being a paralegal. Patricia had built a respectable career in that role, but the implication was clear. My law degree, my 3 years of education, my academic achievements were all irrelevant compared to real experience. "I'll keep looking," I said, trying to keep the frustration out of my voice. "Of course, honey. I just want you to keep your expectations realistic. The legal field is very competitive, and sometimes the people who succeed aren't necessarily the ones with the best grade." After hanging up, I sat in my small apartment, staring at my diploma which I had hung on the wall next to my law review article. The frame was simple black with a white mat, nothing fancy. Looking at it now, I wondered if Patricia was right about it being just an expensive piece of paper. Nicole called that evening from Milwaukee, where she had started working for a mid-sized firm, specializing in employment law. Her enthusiasm was infectious as she described her first few weeks, the cases she was working on, the partners who were already giving her substantive responsibility. "It's everything I hoped law school would prepare us for," she said. "I know the job search has been tough for you, but something good is going to happen. You're too talented for it not to." I wanted to believe her, but Patricia's words had taken root. What if I wasn't as talented as Nicole thought? What if my academic success had been the result of a system that didn't reflect real-world competence? What if Patricia, with her 20 years of practical experience, understood something about the legal profession that I was too naive to see? These doubts followed me through the summer as I continued applying for positions, each rejection email feeling like confirmation that perhaps my mother had been right all along. I started considering her suggestion about paralegal work, wondering if I should have listened to her earlier warnings about the impracticality of my legal ambitions. It wasn't until late July, during a particularly low point in my job search, that I received an email that would change everything. The sender was someone I didn't recognize, Catherine Walsh, with an email signature indicating she was a clerk for Justice Catherine Walsh of the United States Supreme Court. At first I thought it might be spam or some kind of mistake. Supreme Court justices didn't email random law school graduates, but as I read the message more carefully, my heart began to race. "Dear Ms. Hoffman," the email began, "Justice Walsh read your law review article on judicial precedent and constitutional interpretation with great interest. She would like to invite you to apply for a position as her law clerk for the upcoming term. Please find attached the application materials, and let us know if you would be available for a phone interview next week." I read the email 3 times before its contents fully registered. A Supreme Court justice wanted me to apply to be her law clerk. Not just any position, but one of the most prestigious roles a young lawyer could hope for. Law clerks to Supreme Court justices often went on to argue cases before the court themselves, to become federal judges, to shape constitutional law in ways that most attorneys could only dream of. My hands were shaking as I opened the attachment. The application was extensive, requiring writing samples, references, and a detailed personal statement about my interest in constitutional law, but none of that mattered in that moment. What mattered was that Justice Walsh had not only read my work but had been impressed enough to seek me out personally. I called Nicole immediately, barely able to contain my excitement as I read her the email. "Claire, this is incredible," she practically shouted into the phone. Do you know how rare this is? Supreme Court justices don't just randomly invite people to apply for clerkships. Your work must have really impressed her. The irony wasn't lost on me. The law review article that Justice Walsh had read, the one that caught the attention of one of the most powerful legal minds in the country, was the same piece of work that Patricia had dismissed as academic nonsense when I had tried to explain it to her months earlier. As I began working on the application materials that evening, I felt a shift in my perspective that I hadn't experienced since graduation day. For the first time since Patricia's cutting comments under that tent in Chicago, I began to believe that maybe, just maybe, my law degree wasn't worthless after all. The application process was rigorous. The phone interview with Justice Walsh herself was both terrifying and exhilarating. She asked detailed questions about constitutional theory, about my research methodology, about my views on judicial interpretation, but she also asked about my background, my motivations for studying law, and my long-term career goals. I was particularly impressed, Justice Walsh said during our conversation, with your analysis of how historical precedent should inform modern constitutional interpretation. It's rare to see such nuanced thinking from someone so early in their career. I thanked her, trying to keep my voice steady, despite the surreal nature of discussing constitutional law with a Supreme Court justice. When she asked about my influences and inspirations, I found myself talking about the Supreme Court arguments I had watched as a teenager, the way I had been drawn to the intersection of law and justice, the belief that legal reasoning could be a tool for protecting individual rights and promoting fairness. That idealism is important, Justice Walsh said, and I could hear the smile in her voice. The law needs people who remember why it matters. 2 weeks later, I received the call. I had been selected as one of Justice Walsh's law clerks for the upcoming term. The position would begin in September and would last for 1 year. It was, the caller explained, one of the most competitive positions in the legal profession, typically reserved for graduates from the very top of their law school classes, who had demonstrated exceptional analytical and writing ability. After hanging up the phone, I sat in my apartment for a long time, staring at my diploma on the wall. The same degree that Patricia had called worthless had just opened the door to the highest court in the land. The academic work she had dismissed as theoretical nonsense had caught the attention of one of the most respected legal minds in America. I thought about calling Patricia immediately to share the news, but something held me back. Part of me wanted to savor this moment before exposing it to her particular brand of skepticism. Part of me was afraid that she would find a way to diminish even this achievement, to explain why it wasn't as significant as it seemed, or why it wouldn't lead to the kind of practical success she valued. Instead, I called Daniel first. His reaction was everything I could have hoped for, pure joy and excitement, followed by detailed questions about what the position would involve and whether I was prepared for the intensity of working at the Supreme Court. "Claire, this is incredible," he said. "Do you realize what this means for your career? Supreme Court clerks go on to do amazing things. This validates everything you've worked for." Nicole's reaction was similar, but she also understood the deeper significance in a way that Daniel, sweet as he was, couldn't quite grasp. "After everything your mother said about your degree being worthless," Nicole said, "I hope she realizes now how wrong she was. This isn't just a good job, Claire. This is recognition that you're one of the most promising legal minds of your generation." That evening, I finally worked up the courage to call Patricia. I had rehearsed the conversation in my head, trying to anticipate her possible responses and prepare myself for whatever form her skepticism might take. "Hello, Claire," she answered, her voice carrying that familiar tone of mild distraction, as if I were interrupting something more important. "Hi, Mom. I have some news I wanted to share with you." "Oh, did you finally find a position somewhere?" The phrasing stung a little. Finally find a position, as if my job search had been unreasonably prolonged or unsuccessful. "Actually, yes, I've been offered a position as a law clerk for Justice Catherine Walsh at the Supreme Court." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. When Patricia finally spoke, her voice was carefully controlled. "The Supreme Court, as in the Supreme Court in Washington?" "Yes." Justice Walsh read my law review article and personally invited me to apply. It's a one-year clerkship starting in September. Another pause. I could almost hear the wheels turning in Patricia's mind, trying to process this information and figure out how to respond. Well, she said finally, that's unexpected. I'm not entirely sure what a law clerk does, but I suppose if it's a real job with a real salary, that's good news. I felt my excitement deflating slightly, even faced with objective evidence of my achievement, a position that any lawyer would recognize as extraordinary. Patricia's response was lukewarm at best. It's actually quite prestigious, Mom. Supreme Court clerks often go on to become federal judges or partners at major law firms. Justice Walsh only selects 4 clerks each year from thousands of applicants. I see. And how long did you say this position lasts? 1 year. So it's temporary work then. What happens after that? I hadn't expected this line of questioning. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I had assumed that Patricia would be impressed, or at least acknowledge the significance of the opportunity. Instead, she seemed focused on its limitations. Well, after clerking for a Supreme Court justice, there are usually many opportunities available. Most clerks go on to very successful careers. Usually, Patricia repeated. But there are no guarantees. Are there? And what's the salary like for this temporary position? The conversation continued in this vein for several more minutes, with Patricia asking practical questions about logistics and compensation, while seeming to miss entirely the honor and opportunity that the position represented. By the time we hung up, I felt more deflated than celebrated. Daniel found me that evening sitting on my couch, staring at my law degree again. "How did your mom take the news?" he asked, settling beside me. "About how you'd expect," I said with a sigh. She seemed more concerned about whether it pays well and what I'll do afterward, than about what it actually means. Daniel was quiet for a moment. "You know," he said finally, "I've been thinking about something. My mom isn't perfect, but when I told her about getting into my residency program, she cried. Not because she understood all the details, but because she could see that it mattered to me, and that I had worked hard for it." His words highlighted something I had been trying not to acknowledge. Normal parents, supportive parents, celebrated their children's achievements even when they didn't fully understand them. They trusted that if their child was excited and proud, there was good reason for it. "I think," Daniel continued gently, "that maybe your mom has a hard time celebrating anything that makes you seem more successful than she is." It was a thought that had occurred to me before but that I had always pushed away. The idea that Patricia might actively undermine my achievements out of some kind of competition or jealousy seemed too harsh, too uncharitable. But as I reflected on her reactions over the years, to my good grades, my law school acceptance, my academic honors, and now this clerkship, a pattern began to emerge. Patricia had spent 20 years as a paralegal, always talking about how much she knew about the law, but never having pursued formal legal education herself. She often made comments about lawyers being impractical or out of touch, but there was an undercurrent of resentment in those observations that I was only beginning to recognize. Over the next few days, as word of my clerkship spread among my law school friends and professors, the contrast between their reactions and Patricia's became even more stark. Dean Chandler sent a personal congratulations email, noting that I was the first Northwestern graduate in 5 years to clerk for Justice Walsh. My constitutional law professor called to say that he wasn't surprised, but was thrilled to see my work getting the recognition it deserved. Even acquaintances from law school reached out on social media to congratulate me. The general consensus seemed to be that this was an extraordinary achievement, the kind of opportunity that could define an entire legal career. But when I called Patricia a few days later to give her more details about the position, her response was tellingly different. "I've been thinking about this Supreme Court thing," she said without preamble. "I hope you're not getting a big head about it. These temporary positions, they're often just ways for important people to get cheap labor from young graduates who are impressed by fancy titles." The comment caught me off guard. I had called, hoping that maybe she had had time to research the position and understand its significance. Instead, she seemed to have spent the time finding ways to diminish it. "Mom, It's not cheap labor, it's actually quite competitive and well respected. Claire, she interrupted, I know you want this to be more meaningful than it is, but you need to be realistic. You're essentially going to be a research assistant for 1 year. When it's over, you'll be back where you started, except a year older and with even higher expectations that might not match reality. I felt that familiar sinking sensation, the way Patricia's words always seemed to find the exact spots where my own insecurities lived. Justice Walsh specifically sought me out, I said, trying to maintain my confidence. She read my work and was impressed enough to invite me to apply. Honey, I'm sure your professors told you all sorts of nice things about your writing, but that doesn't mean it translates to the real world. Academic writing and practical legal work are very different things. The conversation ended with me feeling confused and deflated once again. I had achieved something that any objective measure would consider remarkable. Yet Patricia's reaction made me question whether I was being naive about its significance. That weekend, I drove to Milwaukee to visit Nicole. I needed to be around someone who understood both the legal profession and the magnitude of what I had accomplished. Nicole had thrived in her new position, and her excitement about the law was infectious. I keep letting her get in my head, I admitted as we sat in her small apartment, sharing a bottle of wine and catching up on everything that had happened since graduation. That's what people like your mom do. Nicole said they can't stand to see other people succeed because it highlights their own limitations. So they find ways to make success seem like failure, achievement seem like naivety. She paused, swirling her wine thoughtfully. Claire, do you know how many law students dream of clerking for the Supreme Court? Do you know how many practicing attorneys would give anything for that opportunity? Your mom calling it temporary work is like calling the Sistine Chapel just a ceiling paint. Nicole's perspective helped, but I still struggled with the cognitive dissonance between the external validation I was receiving and Patricia's persistent skepticism. It was as if I were living in two different realities, one where my achievements mattered and were recognized, and another where they were constantly questioned and diminished. As my start date at the Supreme Court approached, I threw myself into preparation. I read extensively about Justice Walsh's judicial philosophy, studied recent court decisions, and researched the cases that were likely to come before the court in the upcoming term. The work was intellectually demanding in exactly the way I had hoped when I first decided to study law. During my final week before moving to Washington, Patricia called with what she described as some practical advice for my new position. I've been talking to some of the attorneys at our firm, she said, and they mentioned that law clerks sometimes have trouble adjusting to the difference between academic work and real legal practice. They suggested that you should be very careful not to come across as too theoretical or academic in your approach. The advice felt like a subtle attack disguised as helpful guidance. The implication was that my academic background, the very thing that had gotten me the clerkship, was somehow a liability that I needed to overcome. I think Justice Walsh hired me precisely because of my academic background, I said carefully. Maybe, Patricia replied, but remember that even Supreme Court justices have to deal with practical realities. Don't let your success go to your head, and don't assume that academic achievement translates to practical competence. As I hung up the phone, I realized that Patricia's reaction to my clerkship had revealed something important about our relationship that I had been reluctant to acknowledge. No matter what I achieved, no matter how objectively successful I became, she would always find a way to question it, to diminish it, to remind me that I might not be as capable as I believed. The pattern was becoming impossible to ignore, and for the first time, I began to wonder whether the problem wasn't with my achievements or my perspective, but with Patricia's inability to celebrate my success. Standing in my mostly packed apartment, looking at my law degree one more time before taking it down to pack, I made a decision. I was going to Washington to work for one of the most brilliant legal minds in America, someone who had seen enough value in my work to seek me out personally. Whatever Patricia's issues were with my success, I wasn't going to let them define how I saw myself or my accomplishments. For the first time since graduation day, I felt genuinely excited about my future. The Supreme Court was waiting, and I was ready to prove to myself, if not to Patricia, that my law degree was anything but worthless. Moving to Washington felt like stepping into a different universe. The city buzzed with an energy I had never experienced before, where every conversation seemed to carry weight, and every building held decades of consequential decision. My small studio apartment near DuPont Circle was nothing fancy, but waking up each morning, knowing I would spend my day at the Supreme Court, made even the cramped space feel like a palace. Justice Walsh's chambers were located on the second floor of the Supreme Court building, accessed through corridors lined with portraits of former justices, whose decisions had shaped American law for generations. The first time I walked those halls, I felt the weight of legal history pressing down on me, in the most exhilarating way possible. My fellow clerks were exactly what I had expected: brilliant, driven individuals who had graduated at the top of their classes from schools like Harvard, Yale, and Stanford. There was Marcus Chen from Yale, who had clerked for a federal appellate judge before joining Justice Walsh's chamber. Sarah Williams from Harvard had worked for a prestigious white shoe firm before deciding to pursue academia. David Rodriguez from Stanford had already published several law review articles on constitutional interpretation. During our first week, Justice Walsh held individual meetings with each of her new clerks. When my turn came, I sat across from her in her private office, surrounded by floor-to-ceiling bookshelves filled with legal treatises, case reports, and what appeared to be first editions of significant legal texts. "Claire," she began, settling back in her chair with a warm smile, "I want you to know that I don't make hiring decisions lightly. Your law review article demonstrated exactly the kind of analytical thinking and constitutional understanding that makes for exceptional legal scholarship." I thanked her, still struggling to believe that I was actually sitting in a Supreme Court justice's office having this conversation. "I'm particularly interested in your background," she continued. "You didn't come from a family of lawyers or judges. Your perspective on constitutional law seems grounded in a genuine belief in justice, rather than just intellectual exercise. That's refreshing and valuable." The conversation lasted nearly an hour, during which Justice Walsh asked about my research interests, my long-term career goals, and my thoughts on several pending cases. She listened intently to my responses, occasionally asking follow-up questions that pushed me to think more deeply about complex legal issues. "I have high expectations for all my clerks," she said as our meeting concluded, "but I also believe in supporting their growth and development. This year should challenge you intellectually, while preparing you for whatever path you choose to pursue afterward." Walking out of her office, I felt a surge of confidence that I hadn't experienced since before graduation day. Justice Walsh saw value in my work, in my perspective, in my potential contributions to constitutional law. Her belief in me felt like validation of everything I had worked toward. That evening, I called Daniel to share how my first week had gone. He was in his final year of residency, working brutal hours at a hospital in Minneapolis, but he always made time to hear about my experiences at the court. "It sounds like Justice Walsh really sees your potential," he said after I described our meeting. "I hope you're starting to believe in yourself the way the rest of us do." His comment made me realize how much Patricia's constant undermining had affected my self-confidence. Even surrounded by evidence of my capabilities, my law school performance, my law review publication, my selection for this prestigious clerkship, I still struggled with imposter syndrome and self-doubt. "I think I'm getting there," I said. "Being here, working on these cases, it feels like everything I studied is finally coming together in a meaningful way." Nicole called later that same week, eager to hear about my transition to Washington. Her own career was flourishing in Milwaukee, where she had already been given significant responsibility on several high-profile employment discrimination cases. "Remember when your mom said your degree was just expensive paper?" Nicole asked during our conversation. "I wonder what she'd think if she could see you now, working directly with a Supreme Court justice on cases that will shape constitutional law for decades." It was a good question, one that I had been avoiding thinking about too deeply. I had spoken to Patricia only once since arriving in Washington, a brief conversation, where she had asked about my living arrangements and salary, but showed little interest in the actual substance of my work. "I don't think she really understands what I'm doing here," I admitted to Nicole. When I tried to explain the cert petition process, she seemed more interested in whether I was getting enough sleep and eating regular meals. Nicole was quiet for a moment. Claire, I think your mom might be one of those people who can't handle their children surpassing them. It's easier for her to dismiss your achievements than to acknowledge that you've accomplished things she never could. The observation stung because it rang true. Patricia had spent 20 years in the legal field, but had never pursued the education or credentials that would have allowed her to advance beyond her paralegal role. My success in law school and now at the Supreme Court highlighted possibilities she had either been unwilling or unable to pursue herself. My work during those first few months was intellectually demanding in ways that law school had only begun to prepare me for. Justice Walsh assigned me to work on several significant cases, including a First Amendment challenge to government surveillance programs and a complex constitutional question about the separation of powers between federal and state governments. The research required was exhaustive and precise. Every memo I produced would potentially influence how Justice Walsh approached oral arguments, and ultimately, how she voted on cases that would affect millions of Americans. The responsibility was both thrilling and terrifying. One particular case captured my attention more than the others. It involved a challenge to state restrictions on voting rights, specifically whether certain identification requirements constituted an undue burden on citizens' constitutional right to participate in elections. The legal questions were complex, involving decades of precedent about the balance between state authority and individual rights. I spent weeks researching the historical development of voting rights jurisprudence, analyzing how previous courts had approached similar questions, and examining the factual record to understand the real-world impact of the challenged restriction. My memo for Justice Walsh was over 50 pages long, meticulously footnoted and carefully reasoned. When Justice Walsh called me into her office after reviewing my work, I was nervous about her feedback. Legal writing at this level was different from anything I had done in law school, and I wasn't sure whether my analysis would meet her standards. "Claire," she said, gesturing for me to sit down, "this memo is exceptional work. Your analysis of the historical precedent is thorough and insightful, and your synthesis of the competing constitutional principles is exactly what I needed to understand the full scope of this case." The relief I felt was overwhelming. "Thank you, Justice Walsh. I wanted to make sure I captured all the relevant considerations." "You did more than that," she continued. "You've helped me see connections between cases that I hadn't fully appreciated before. This is exactly the kind of scholarly rigor that makes for good constitutional analysis." She paused, looking thoughtful. "I'm planning to share portions of your research with the other justices during our conference discussion of this case. Would you be comfortable with that level of visibility for your work?" I was stunned. Having my research shared with the entire Supreme Court was an honor I hadn't dared to imagine. "Of course, Justice Walsh. I'd be honored." That evening, I called Patricia to share this development. I had been hesitant to discuss my work in detail with her, given her previous reactions, but this felt too significant not to mention. "Mom, I wanted to let you know about something exciting that happened at work today." "Oh? Are you finally settling? I've been worried that you might be in over your head with all those experienced lawyers." Her immediate assumption that I might be struggling deflated my enthusiasm slightly, but I pressed on. "Actually, things are going really well." Justice Walsh was so impressed with a research memo I wrote that she's planning to share it with the other justices when they discuss the case. There was a pause on the other end of the line. "What kind of memo?" I explained the voting rights case and the constitutional questions involved, trying to convey both the complexity of the legal issues and the significance of having my work reviewed by the entire court. "So you're writing reports for your boss?" Patricia said when I finished. "That sounds like normal work responsibilities to me." The dismissive tone was familiar, but it still caught me off guard. "It's a bit more than that, Mom. The research I'm doing will potentially influence how the Supreme Court decides a major constitutional case." "Claire, honey, I think you might be overstating your role here. You're a research assistant. Essentially, the important decisions are made by people with much more experience than you have." I felt the familiar frustration build. Even when presented with objective evidence of my contributions and their significance, Patricia found ways to minimize them. Justice Walsh specifically said that my analysis helped her understand the case in new ways. I said, trying to keep my voice steady. I'm sure she was being encouraged. That's what good supervisors do, but remember, you're still very junior in your career. Don't let praise go to your head. After hanging up, I sat in my small apartment, feeling deflated and confused. The contrast between Justice Walsh's recognition of my work and Patricia's dismissal was jarring. I found myself questioning whether I was indeed overestimating my contributions, or whether Patricia was simply incapable of acknowledging my professional growth. Daniel's perspective when I called him later that evening was characteristically direct. Claire, you're working for one of the most brilliant legal minds in America. If Justice Walsh says your work is exceptional, that means something. Your mom's opinion doesn't change the objective reality of what you're accomplishing. His words helped, but I still struggled with the cognitive dissonance. Patricia's voice had been a constant presence in my head for so long that it was difficult to trust external validation when it conflicted with her assessment. The voting rights case continued to progress through the court's deliberative process. I attended oral arguments, sitting in the section reserved for clerks and watching as the country's most skilled constitutional lawyers presented their cases before the 9 justices. The experience was everything I had dreamed it would be: intellectually rigorous, consequential, and deeply connected to the fundamental principles that governed American democracy. During the argument, I noticed Justice Walsh asking several questions that directly related to research I had conducted. She explored the historical context of voting rights precedent in ways that reflected the analysis I had provided in my memo. Sitting there, watching my work contribute to the court's understanding of the case, I felt a profound sense of purpose and accomplishment. After the argument, Justice Walsh asked me to prepare additional research on one of the questions that had emerged during oral argument. The assignment required me to dig even deeper into historical materials and to synthesize information from multiple areas of constitutional law. Working on this follow-up research, I realized how much my analytical skills had developed since arriving at the court. The combination of Justice Walsh's mentorship, the intellectual demands of the work, and the exposure to the highest level of constitutional reasoning had accelerated my growth as a legal thinker in ways that surprised me. When I submitted the additional memo, Justice Walsh's response was even more positive than before. Claire, this work demonstrates exactly the kind of sophisticated constitutional analysis that distinguishes exceptional lawyers from merely competent ones. You've identified connections and implications that will be valuable not just for this case, but for future decisions as well. She paused, studying me carefully. I've been thinking about your future career plans. Have you given any thought to academia? Your research skills and analytical approach would translate well to legal scholarship. The suggestion caught me completely off guard. I had always assumed that after my clerkship, I would pursue traditional practice at a law firm or perhaps seek a position in government. The idea of becoming a law professor had never seriously occurred to me. I hadn't really considered it. I admitted, I'm not sure I have the background for academic work. Justice Walsh smiled. Claire, you've been doing academic work all year. Legal scholarship is essentially what you've been producing in these memos: original research, careful analysis, and clear communication of complex ideas. The difference is that professors publish their work in law reviews, rather than sharing it only with judges. Over the following weeks, Justice Walsh continued to encourage me to consider academic possibilities. She introduced me to several law professors who visited the court, arranged for me to attend academic conferences on constitutional law, and suggested that I think about developing my voting rights research into a publishable law review article. The encouragement was intoxicating. For the first time since law school, I began to envision a career path that aligned perfectly with my intellectual interests and analytical strengths. The prospect of contributing to constitutional scholarship, of influencing legal thought through research and writing, felt like exactly what I was meant to do. When I mentioned these developing career possibilities to Patricia during one of our increasingly infrequent phone calls, her reaction was predictably skeptical. Academic work? She said, her voice carrying that familiar note of disapproval. Claire, that's even more theoretical than what you're doing now. How do academics make a living? Do they even have stable jobs? I explained the tenure process, the combination of teaching and research that comprised professorial work, and the way legal academics influenced both legal education and judicial decision-making. It sounds very uncertain, Patricia concluded, and very removed from real legal practice. I thought the point of law school was to prepare you to be a practicing attorney, not to become a permanent student. Her characterization of academic work as being a permanent student stung. It reflected a fundamental misunderstanding of what legal scholars actually did and the impact their work had on the legal system. Academic lawyers often argue cases before the Supreme Court, I said, trying to help her understand the practical significance of legal scholarship. They write briefs that influence major decisions and consult with lawmakers on constitutional questions. Maybe some of them do, Patricia replied, but most of them just write articles that other academics read. It seems like a very insular world to me. The conversation left me feeling frustrated and defensive. Patricia's inability to see value in intellectual work, in research and scholarship, seemed to extend beyond mere practical concerns to a fundamental discomfort with academic achievement itself. Over the next several months, as my clerkship progressed and my work continued to earn recognition from Justice Walsh and visiting academics, the contrast between my professional reality and Patricia's perception of it became increasingly stark. I was contributing to constitutional law at the highest level, yet Patricia continued to frame my work as impractical theorizing. The voting rights case was eventually decided, with the court ruling in a way that incorporated several of the analytical frameworks I had developed in my research. Justice Walsh's opinion cited historical precedent and constitutional principles that directly reflected work I had done. Seeing my research contribute to a Supreme Court decision that would protect voting rights for millions of Americans was the most professionally satisfying experience of my life. When the decision was announced, legal commentators praised Justice Walsh's opinion for its thorough historical analysis and careful constitutional reasoning. Several law professors reached out to me, having learned through academic networks about my contributions to the case. One professor from Columbia Law School specifically mentioned my research in a law review article, analyzing the decision. That evening I called Patricia to share the news about the decision and my role in it. The Supreme Court case I've been working on was decided today, I began, trying to contain my excitement. The court accepted the constitutional framework I developed in my research, and it's going to protect voting rights across the country. Patricia's response was characteristically deflating. That's nice, dear. I'm sure your boss appreciated your help with her work. The casual dismissal of what I considered a career-defining achievement was particularly painful. Patricia seemed determined to view my contributions as mere assistance rather than substantive intellectual work. It was actually my analysis that shaped how Justice Walsh approached the constitutional questions, I said, unable to keep the frustration out of my voice. Claire, I think you're giving yourself too much credit. Supreme Court justices don't rely on research assistants to make their decisions. They have decades of experience and knowledge that you simply don't have yet. The conversation ended with me feeling angry and misunderstood. Patricia's persistent refusal to acknowledge my professional growth and contributions seemed intentional at this point, as if she were actively choosing to diminish my achievements rather than simply failing to understand them. Daniel's reaction to the Supreme Court decision was everything Patricia's should have been. When I called to tell him about the case outcome and the recognition my work was receiving, his enthusiasm was genuine and supportive. Claire, do you realize what you've accomplished? You're not even 30 years old, and you've already contributed to a Supreme Court decision that will protect constitutional rights for generations. This is extraordinary. His validation helped counteract some of the deflation I felt after speaking with Patricia, but I was beginning to recognize a pattern that extended far beyond career achievement. Patricia seemed incapable of celebrating my successes, regardless of their objective significance or the recognition they received from others. Nicole's perspective when I shared my frustrations with her during a weekend visit to Milwaukee was characteristically insightful. Your mom isn't just dismissing your work, she observed as we sat in her favorite coffee shop near Lake Michigan. She's actively working to make you doubt your own achievements. That's not normal parental behavior, even for parents who don't understand their children's career. Nicole paused, stirring her latte thoughtfully. I think she's threatened by your success because it highlights the limitations of her own choices. Instead of feeling proud that her daughter exceeded her achievements, she feels diminished by them. The observation was painful but illuminating. I had always attributed Patricia's reactions to practical concerns or misunderstanding, but Nicole's analysis suggested something more deliberate and psychologically complex. What do you think I should do? I asked. Stop seeking her approval, Nicole said gently but firmly. You've achieved extraordinary things, and the people who matter in your professional life recognize that. You don't need your mom's validation to know that your work has value. As my clerkship entered its final months, Justice Walsh began discussing my future career plans more seriously. She had arranged meetings with law school deans, recommended me for academic fellowships, and encouraged me to develop a research agenda that could form the foundation of a scholarly career. Claire, she said during one of our regular mentoring conversations, you have the intellectual curiosity and analytical skills to make significant contributions to constitutional scholarship. I hope you'll seriously consider pursuing academic opportunity. The encouragement was professionally thrilling, but it also created a new source of conflict with Patricia. When I mentioned that I was exploring academic positions, her reaction was more negative than ever. Claire, I'm worried that you're losing sight of practical realities, she said during a phone call in early spring. All this talk about constitutional scholarship and Supreme Court research, it's very impressive sounding, but where does it lead? What kind of stable career can you build on such theoretical work? I tried to explain the academic job market, the opportunities available to former Supreme Court clerks, and the intellectual satisfaction I found in constitutional research. But Patricia seemed determined to frame academic work as impractical dreaming, rather than legitimate career development. I just think you should be careful about getting too caught up in the prestige and losing sight of what really matters, she concluded. A steady job with good benefits, the ability to support yourself and eventually a family, those are the things that matter in the long run. After hanging up, I realized that Patricia's vision of success and mine had diverged so completely that meaningful communication about my career had become impossible. She valued stability and conventional markers of achievement, while I was drawn to intellectual challenge and the opportunity to contribute to constitutional understanding. The disconnect was becoming too significant to ignore, and for the first time I began to consider the possibility that Patricia's persistent negativity about my achievements might reflect her own limitations rather than practical wisdom about my career prospects. As spring turned toward summer and my clerkship neared its end, I received several academic job offers from prestigious law schools. The opportunities were exactly what Justice Walsh had predicted: chances to teach constitutional law, conduct research, and contribute to legal scholarship at institutions that valued intellectual rigor and analytical depth. When I called Patricia to share this news, her reaction was the most negative yet. Academic jobs? She said, her voice sharp with disapproval. Claire, those aren't real careers. They're extended studentships for people who can't handle the real world. You've spent 6 years in school and now you want to spend the rest of your life in classrooms. The harshness of her response shocked me. Even by Patricia's standards, the outright hostility was unusual. Teaching law is a real career. Law professors shape the next generation of attorneys and influence legal development through their scholarship. It's playing pretend, Patricia replied. Real lawyers practice law, they represent clients, argue cases, solve actual problems. What you're talking about is just talking about law, not actually doing it. The conversation deteriorated from there, with Patricia becoming increasingly critical not just of academic work, but of my entire career trajectory since law school. By the time we hung up, I felt emotionally drained and confused. That evening, I called Daniel to process what had happened. She's never been this hostile before, I told him. It's like my success is somehow threatening to her in a way I don't understand. Daniel was quiet for a moment. Claire, I think your mom might be dealing with her own feelings of inadequacy. The more successful you become, the more obvious it is that she could have pursued similar opportunities if she had made different choices. His analysis echoed Nicole's earlier observations, and I began to recognize that Patricia's reactions to my achievements might have more to do with her own psychology than with legitimate concerns about my career choices. As I prepared for the next phase of my career, I realized that I would need to make peace with the fact that Patricia might never be able to celebrate my successes or support my professional growth. The recognition and opportunities I was receiving from Justice Walsh, law school deans, and constitutional scholars provided objective validation of my work and potential. Standing in my apartment one evening, looking at the framed Supreme Court decision that included research I had contributed, I finally understood what Nicole had been trying to tell me. I didn't need Patricia's approval to know that my law degree had value, that my work mattered, and that the career path I was choosing aligned with both my abilities and my aspirations. The worthless piece of paper she had dismissed at my graduation had opened doors to the highest levels of constitutional law and had positioned me for a career that would allow me to contribute to legal scholarship and education for decades to come. Justice Walsh's recognition of my potential meant more than Patricia's persistent skepticism, and it was time I started believing. For the first time since graduation day, I felt genuinely confident about my professional future, regardless of whether Patricia could understand or appreciate the path I was choosing. The Supreme Court clerkship had proven to me that my analytical skills, legal knowledge, and research abilities were exactly what I had believed them to be, even when Patricia's constant undermining had made me doubt myself. As my year at the court drew to a close, I began to see Patricia's reaction to my achievements, not as wisdom or practical concern, but as a reflection of her own limitations and fear. That recognition was both painful and liberating, marking the beginning of my ability to trust my own judgment about my career and capabilities, rather than seeking validation from someone who seemed incapable of providing it. The call came on a Tuesday morning in late July, just 3 weeks before my clerkship was scheduled to end. I was in Justice Walsh's chambers, reviewing draft opinions, when my phone buzzed with a Portland area code. Normally I wouldn't answer during work hours, but something about the timing felt urgent. "Claire, honey, it's Mom." Patricia's voice sounded strained, unusual for someone who typically maintained such careful control over her tone. "I need to talk to you about something important." I stepped into the hallway, concerned that perhaps something had happened to my father or Marcus. "Is everything okay? Is Dad all right?" "Everyone's fine, physically," she said, but there was an edge to her voice that suggested otherwise. "But I've been hearing some disturbing things about this Supreme Court position of yours, and I think we need to have a serious conversation." The phrasing immediately put me on guard. "Disturbing things? What do you mean?" "Well, I was talking to Janet Morrison from the firm. You remember Janet? She's been practicing family law for 15 years, and she mentioned that she'd heard about your situation from some colleagues in Portland. Apparently, there are some concerns about your professional reputation." My stomach dropped. Janet Morrison was one of the senior paralegals at Patricia's firm, known for her gossip network that extended throughout the Portland legal community. If she was spreading information about me, it couldn't be good. "What kind of concern?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "Janet heard from a partner at Henderson and Associates that there are questions about your work quality and professionalism, something about academic arrogance and difficulty taking direction from experienced attorneys." The accusation was so far from reality that I almost laughed. Justice Walsh had consistently praised my work, and I had received nothing but positive feedback from everyone at the court. The idea that Portland lawyers were questioning my professionalism seemed absurd. "Mom, that doesn't make any sense. My work here has been consistently excellent. Justice Walsh just told me last week that my research on the Commerce Clause case was some of the best analysis she's seen from a clerk." Patricia's sigh was audible through the phone. "Claire, this is exactly what I was worried about. You're so caught up in the praise from your academic bubble that you can't see how you're being perceived in the real legal community." "The Supreme Court isn't an academic bubble," I said, feeling my frustration rise. "It's literally the highest court in the country." "Yes, but it's also very theoretical and removed from practical law practice." Janet mentioned that several Portland firms have noted your name as someone who might be difficult to work with because of unrealistic expectations developed during this clerkship. The conversation was becoming surreal. I couldn't understand how my name would even be circulating among Portland law firms, let alone in a negative context. I had barely had any contact with the Portland legal community since starting my clerkship. How would Portland firms even know anything about my work here? I asked. The legal community is smaller than you think, Claire. People talk, reputations spread. Janet said that some firms are already taking your name off their consideration lists for future positions. That evening I called Nicole immediately after returning to my apartment. The conversation with Patricia had left me feeling anxious and confused in a way I hadn't experienced since my early days at the court. That makes absolutely no sense, Nicole said after I recounted the phone call. How would Portland firms know anything about your day-to-day work at the Supreme Court, and why would they be discussing it negatively when everyone in the legal profession knows that Supreme Court clerkships are prestigious positions? Nicole's confusion mirrored my own. The more I thought about Patricia's claims, the less plausible they seemed. Also, Nicole continued, I know some people at Henderson and Associates from law school networking events. They're a mid-tier family law firm. Why would they be tracking the professional reputation of a Supreme Court clerk? It doesn't add up. Her analysis helped calm some of my anxiety, but I still felt unsettled by Patricia's call. Even if the specific claims were questionable, the conversation had planted seeds of doubt about how my work was being perceived more broadly. Daniel's reaction when I called him later was more direct. Claire, this sounds like your mom is manufacturing problems to make you doubt yourself. Think about it, you're succeeding in ways she never did, and instead of celebrating that, she's finding ways to make you question your achievement. His observation was uncomfortable but compelling. The timing of Patricia's concerns seemed suspicious, coming just as I was making decisions about academic job offers and feeling increasingly confident about my professional trajectory. Over the next few days, I found myself distracted at work, second-guessing interactions with Justice Walsh and wondering if I was indeed coming across as arrogant or difficult. The doubts were irrational. My performance reviews had been consistently excellent, but Patricia's words had triggered the same insecurities that had plagued me since law school graduation. Justice Walsh noticed my distraction during one of our weekly meetings. Claire, you seem preoccupied lately. Is everything all right? Are you feeling overwhelmed by the transition planning for your next position? I debated whether to mention Patricia's call, ultimately deciding that Justice Walsh's perspective might help me understand whether there was any validity to the concerns that had been raised. I received some troubling feedback about my professional reputation, I said carefully. Someone mentioned that there might be concerns about my work style or attitude in the broader legal community. Justice Walsh looked genuinely puzzled. That's very surprising to hear. Could you be more specific about the nature of these concerns? I explained Patricia's conversation with Janet Morrison, the alleged discussions among Portland firms, and the suggestions that my academic approach might be seen as problematic in practical legal settings. Justice Walsh listened thoughtfully, occasionally asking clarifying questions about the sources of this information and the specific criticisms that had been mentioned. Claire, she said when I finished, I have to tell you that this feedback is completely inconsistent with everything I've observed about your work and professional demeanor. You've been respectful, thorough, and appropriately deferential to authority, while still contributing original insight. She paused, studying me carefully. More importantly, the idea that Portland family law firms would be tracking and discussing the professional reputation of a Supreme Court clerk seems highly implausible. Our work here is largely invisible to practitioners in other areas of law. Her response confirmed my own instincts about the conversation with Patricia, but I still felt the need to understand where these concerns might be coming from. Is it possible that my academic background or research approach might be seen as problematic by practicing attorneys? I asked. Justice Walsh shook her head firmly. Absolutely not. Academic rigor and research skills are highly valued in the legal profession. Some of the most successful practicing attorneys I know have strong academic backgrounds and analytical approaches to legal problems. She leaned forward slightly, her expression becoming more serious. Claire, I'm concerned about who might be providing you with this feedback and what their motivations might be. The characterization of your work and reputation that you've described bears no resemblance to reality. That evening, I decided to do some investigation of my own. I reached out to several professors from Northwestern who had connections in the Portland legal community, asking if they had heard anything about my professional reputation or work at the Supreme Court. The responses were uniformly positive and somewhat confused by my questions. Professor Martinez, who had written one of my recommendations for the clerkship, seemed particularly puzzled. "Claire, I've heard nothing but praise for your work at the court," he said during a phone call. "In fact, several colleagues have mentioned you as an example of the caliber of students our program produces. Where are these concerns coming from?" Professor Chin, who maintained connections with several Portland firms through alumni networks, had a similar response. "I haven't heard any negative commentary about you," she said. "In fact, the general consensus among Portland lawyers I know is that Northwestern should be proud to have a graduate clerking for Justice Walsh. Supreme Court clerkships reflect well on the law school and the student." The unanimous nature of these responses made Patricia's claims seem even more questionable. If there were genuine concerns about my professional reputation, it seemed likely that at least some of my law school contacts would have heard about them. I decided to call Marcus, my brother, to get his perspective on the situation. He had always been more practical than me, and his business background gave him insights into professional dynamics that I sometimes missed. "That sounds really weird, Claire," he said after I explained the situation. "Why would Mom be hearing negative things about your work when everyone else is saying positive things? And why would she be the only one hearing them?" Marcus paused thoughtfully. "Also, I've never known Mom to have that many connections in the legal community. She works at a small firm and doesn't really network outside of it. How would she be hearing gossip about Supreme Court clerks?" His questions highlighted inconsistencies I hadn't fully considered. Patricia's professional network was indeed limited, making it unlikely that she would be privy to broader discussions about my reputation in the legal community. "Do you think she might be making it up?" I asked, feeling uncomfortable even posing the question. Marcus was quiet for a moment. "I don't know if she's making it up entirely, but I think she might be exaggerating or misinterpreting things she's heard. You know how Mom gets when she feels like she's losing control of a situation." His observation about control resonated with me. Patricia had always been most critical when I was making decisions that moved me further from her influence or exceeded her own achievements. Over the weekend, I decided to address the situation directly. I called Patricia and asked her to provide more specific information about the sources of the negative feedback she had mentioned. "I've been thinking about our conversation," I said, trying to keep my tone neutral. "I'd like to understand better where these concerns are coming from so I can address them appropriately." Patricia seemed caught off guard by the direct approach. "Well, as I mentioned, Janet heard about it from colleagues. I don't think it would be appropriate for me to name specific firms or attorneys." "I'm not asking for names," I said, "but could you be more specific about the nature of the criticisms? What exactly are people saying about my work style or attitude?" There was a long pause before Patricia responded. "It's more of a general impression, Claire. People are saying that you might be difficult to manage because of the academic environment you've been working in." The vagueness of her response was telling. If there were genuine professional concerns, they would likely be more specific and actionable. "Has anyone mentioned particular incidents or examples of problematic behavior?" I pressed. Another pause. "Claire, I don't think it's productive to get into specifics. The important thing is that you're aware of these perceptions, so you can be mindful of them in future positions." Her reluctance to provide details made me increasingly skeptical of the entire narrative. Legitimate professional feedback typically included specific examples and actionable suggestions for improvement. After hanging up, I felt more frustrated than ever. The conversation had raised more questions than it answered, and Patricia's evasiveness suggested that her concerns might not be based on reliable information. That evening, I called Janet Morrison directly. If she was indeed the source of this information, I wanted to hear it from her rather than through Patricia's interpretation. Janet seemed surprised to hear from me. "Claire, how are you?" I heard you're working at the Supreme Court. That must be incredibly exciting. Her tone was friendly and congratulatory, which immediately contradicted the impression Patricia had given me. I'm calling because my mom mentioned that you had heard some concerns about my professional reputation from colleagues in Portland. I wanted to understand what you had heard so I could address any issues. Janet sounded genuinely confused. Concerns? I haven't heard anything negative about you, Claire. In fact, the few times your name has come up, it's been in a very positive context. People are impressed that someone from Northwestern is clerking for Justice Walsh. Her response was exactly what I had expected based on my other conversations. But it also meant that Patricia had either misunderstood or misrepresented Janet's comment. Did you perhaps mention something to my mom about my work at the court that she might have misinterpreted? I asked. Janet thought for a moment. The only thing I can think of is that I mentioned to Patricia that Supreme Court clerks sometimes have difficulty adjusting to law firm environments because the work is so different. But that was a general observation about the transition from clerkships to practice, not a specific criticism of you. The pieces began falling into place. Patricia had taken Janet's general comment about the challenges Supreme Court clerks faced and transformed it into specific concerns about my professional reputation. Whether this was intentional manipulation or genuine misunderstanding was unclear, but the effect was the same. Thank you for clarifying that, I said to Janet. I was concerned that there might be issues I needed to address. Not at all, Janet replied. You should be very proud of what you've accomplished. A Supreme Court clerkship is an extraordinary achievement. After hanging up, I felt a mixture of relief and frustration. Relief that there weren't actually professional concerns about my reputation, but frustration that Patricia had either deliberately misled me or had somehow transformed neutral information into a source of anxiety for me. I called Nicole to update her on my investigation. So, your mom took a general comment about Supreme Court clerks and turned it into specific concerns about your reputation, Nicole summarized. And then she presented it in a way that made you doubt your professional success. When she put it that way, the manipulation seemed obvious and deliberate. The question is whether she did it intentionally, I said. Does it matter? Nicole replied. The effect is the same either way. She made you doubt yourself at a time when you should be celebrating your achievements and planning your next career move. Nicole's point was valid, but it also raised uncomfortable questions about Patricia's motivations and the nature of our relationship. If she was deliberately undermining my confidence, that suggested a level of psychological manipulation I wasn't sure I was ready to acknowledge. Over the next week, I found myself paying closer attention to Patricia's patterns of communication and the timing of her concern. I noticed that her most negative comments about my career typically came just after I had shared good news or received recognition for my work. When I mentioned that Justice Walsh had introduced me to the Dean of Harvard Law School as a potential faculty candidate, Patricia's immediate response was to question whether I was getting ahead of myself and whether I had enough practical experience for academic work. When I told her about a law review article I was developing based on my Supreme Court research, she suggested that I should focus on real legal work rather than theoretical writing that no one reads. The pattern was becoming impossible to ignore. Rather than celebrating my achievements or offering encouragement, Patricia consistently found ways to introduce doubt and anxiety into conversations about my professional progress. Daniel noticed the change in my mood during our phone call. You sound stressed lately, he observed during one of our evening conversations. Is everything okay at work? I explained the pattern I had noticed in Patricia's responses to my career developments and the investigation I had conducted into her claims about my professional reputation. Claire, this sounds like textbook emotional manipulation, Daniel said gently. She's systematically undermining your confidence in your achievements and abilities. His clinical perspective was both helpful and disturbing. As a medical resident, Daniel had training in recognizing psychological patterns and unhealthy relationship dynamics. Do you think she's doing it intentionally? I think she's threatened by your success and is responding in ways that protect her own sense of self-worth, even if it means damaging your confidence. Whether it's conscious or unconscious, the behavior is harmful. That weekend, I drove to Portland for Marcus's birthday celebration. I hadn't seen Patricia in person since graduation, and I was curious to observe her behavior more carefully after becoming aware of the manipulation patterns. The birthday dinner was held at a restaurant downtown, with Marcus, his girlfriend Sarah, my father, Patricia, and me. The conversation was pleasant and superficial until Marcus asked about my work at the Supreme Court. "Claire's been working on some really important cases," he said to the table. "She told me her research is being used in major constitutional decisions." I watched Patricia's reaction carefully. Her smile remained in place, but I noticed a subtle tightening around her eyes. "It's always nice when interns get to contribute to their supervisor's work," she said smoothly. The comment was perfectly designed to diminish my role without being overtly critical. By referring to me as an intern rather than a law clerk, and by characterizing my work as contributing to rather than influencing decisions, she managed to reduce my achievements while maintaining plausible deniability. My father, who had been largely absent from discussions about my career, seemed genuinely interested in learning more about my work. "What kind of cases are you working on, Claire?" he asked. I described the voting rights case and the constitutional questions involved, watching Patricia's expression as I spoke. Her discomfort was subtle but noticeable: a slight shift in posture, a tightening of her jaw, a tendency to look away when I mentioned specific achievement. "That sounds very important," my father said when I finished. "You must be learning a tremendous amount." "I'm sure it's a good learning experience," Patricia interjected, "though I hope Claire remembers that practical legal work is quite different from theoretical research." The pattern was exactly what I had begun to expect. Even in front of family, Patricia couldn't resist finding ways to qualify or diminish my achievements. Later that evening, after returning to my childhood home where I was staying for the weekend, Patricia asked to speak with me privately. "Claire, I've been thinking about our conversation a few weeks ago," she began, settling into her favorite chair in the living room. "I hope you didn't take my concerns the wrong way. I'm just trying to help you be realistic about your career prospects." The phrasing was carefully constructed to position her manipulation as helpful guidance. "I've actually looked into those concerns you mentioned," I said, deciding to be direct. "I spoke with Janet Morrison and several of my law school professors. None of them had heard anything negative about my professional reputation." Patricia's expression shifted almost imperceptibly. "Well, that's good to hear. Maybe the concerns I heard were just rumors or misunderstandings." Her quick retreat from the claims she had made was telling. If she had genuinely believed there were professional concerns about my work, she would likely have been more surprised by my findings. "I'm curious about where you originally heard these concerns," I continued. "It might help me understand how such misunderstandings develop." Patricia waved her hand dismissively. "Oh, you know how these things are. Someone mentions something in passing, it gets passed along, details get confused. I'm just glad it turned out to be nothing." Her casual dismissal of claims that had caused me significant anxiety was frustrating. She seemed unwilling to acknowledge the impact her words had had, or to take responsibility for passing along unverified information. "In the future," I said carefully, "I'd appreciate it if you could verify information before sharing concerns about my professional reputation. These kinds of rumors can be damaging if they're not accurate." Patricia's smile became strained. "Of course, dear. I was just trying to look out for your best interest." The conversation ended with both of us maintaining polite facades, but I felt like I had gained important insights into Patricia's behavior pattern. Her quick retreat when challenged suggested that she knew her claims had been questionable, and her framing of manipulation as looking out for my best interests was a classic deflection technique. The next morning, over breakfast, my father asked about my plans after the clerkship ended. "I'm considering several academic positions," I said, watching Patricia's reaction from the corner of my eye. "Justice Walsh has been very encouraging about my potential for legal scholarship." My father nodded approvingly. "That sounds like a good use of your talents, Claire. You've always been good at research and analysis." Patricia's response was predictably negative. "I just hope you're keeping your options open," she said. "Academic positions can be very uncertain, and the job market is quite competitive." The comment was factually accurate, but delivered in a tone that suggested concern rather than encouragement. It was a perfect example of how Patricia could undermine my confidence while maintaining the appearance of offering practical advice. Justice Walsh seems confident that I'd be competitive for academic positions, I replied. Well, she would say that, wouldn't she? Patricia responded with a slight laugh. Supervisors often encourage their employees, even when the prospects aren't realistic. The casual dismissal of Justice Walsh's professional judgment was particularly galling. Patricia was suggesting that one of the most respected legal minds in America couldn't accurately assess my academic potential. My father looked uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation. "I'm sure Claire will make the right decision for her career," he said diplomatically. After breakfast, as I prepared to drive back to Washington, Patricia pulled me aside for a final conversation. "Claire, I hope you know that everything I say comes from a place of love and concern," she said, her voice taking on the earnest tone she used when she wanted to sound particularly sincere. "I appreciate your concern," I replied carefully, "but I think it's important that your advice be based on accurate information rather than rumors or assumptions." Patricia's expression tightened slightly. "I'm just trying to help you avoid disappointment, dear. The legal profession can be very challenging, and I don't want you to have unrealistic expectations." The conversation was a perfect encapsulation of Patricia's approach: frame manipulation as love, present undermining as protection, and position her own limitations as universal truths about professional reality. Driving back to Washington, I reflected on the weekend's interactions and the patterns I had observed. Patricia's behavior toward my achievements was not random or well-intentioned. It was systematic and designed to maintain her psychological comfort at the expense of my confidence and professional growth. For the first time, I began to consider the possibility that Patricia's reaction to my success was not about practical concerns or misunderstanding, but about her own need to feel superior or in control. The recognition was painful but also liberating, marking the beginning of my ability to see our relationship with greater clarity and objectivity. As my clerkship entered its final weeks, I made a conscious decision to stop seeking Patricia's validation or approval for my career choices. Her inability to celebrate my achievements or support my professional growth was a reflection of her own limitations, not an accurate assessment of my capabilities or prospects. The decision felt both frightening and empowering. For the first time since law school graduation, I was ready to trust my own judgment and the feedback of professional mentors over Patricia's persistent skepticism and manipulation. The email arrived on a Thursday morning in early September, just 2 weeks after I had started my position as a visiting assistant professor at Georgetown Law School. I was in my new office, still arranging books and setting up my computer when the message from Harvard Law School's dean appeared in my inbox. "Professor Hoffman," it began, using the title that still felt surreal to me, "we would like to invite you to present your research on constitutional precedent at our faculty workshop series next month. Justice Walsh spoke very highly of your scholarship during our recent conversation, and we believe your work would be of significant interest to our constitutional law faculty." The invitation was unexpected and thrilling. Harvard's Faculty Workshop Series was one of the most prestigious forums for legal scholarship in the country. Being invited to present as a first-year academic was an honor that typically took years to achieve. I immediately called Justice Walsh to thank her for the recommendation and to seek her advice about the presentation. "Claire, this is a wonderful opportunity," she said warmly. "Harvard's constitutional law faculty includes some of the most influential scholars in the field. A successful presentation there could open doors for your entire academic career." We discussed the format of the workshop, the audience I would be addressing, and strategies for presenting complex constitutional analysis to a room full of distinguished professors. Justice Walsh's enthusiasm for my scholarly potential continued to amaze me, especially when contrasted with Patricia's persistent skepticism. That evening I called Daniel to share the news. He was now in his final year of residency, and we had been discussing plans for coordinating our career moves, as we both transitioned to more permanent positions. "This is incredible, Claire," he said, his excitement evident even through the phone. "Harvard Law School. Do you realize how significant this is for someone who just started their academic career?" His genuine pride in my achievement was exactly the response I had hoped for from Patricia, but had learned not to expect. I keep feeling like I need to pinch myself, I admitted. Sometimes I can't believe this is really my life. You've earned every bit of it, Daniel replied firmly. Your work speaks for itself and the right people are recognizing that. When I called Nicole later that week to tell her about the Harvard invitation, her reaction was characteristically insightful. Are you going to tell your mom? She asked after congratulating me on the opportunity. The question gave me pause. I had been so focused on preparing for the presentation that I hadn't considered whether to share the news with Patricia. I'm not sure, I said honestly. Part of me wants to tell her, but I'm tired of having my achievements minimized or questioned. Nicole was quiet for a moment. Maybe it's time to test whether she's capable of being genuinely supportive when you achieve something undeniably prestigious. Her suggestion made sense. If Patricia couldn't celebrate an invitation to present at Harvard Law School, it would provide definitive proof that her negativity wasn't based on legitimate concerns about my career trajectory. I decided to call Patricia that weekend, choosing a time when I felt emotionally prepared for whatever reaction she might have. Hi, Mom. I wanted to share some exciting news with you. Oh, what's that, dear? I could hear the slight edge in her voice that always appeared when I mentioned professional developments. Harvard Law School has invited me to present my constitutional law research at their faculty workshop series next month. It's apparently quite prestigious for someone at my career stage. The Harvard Constitutional Law faculty is considered one of the most influential in the country. Patricia's sigh was audible through the phone. Claire, I hope you're not getting carried away by all this academic attention. Remember that the real test of your career will be whether you can build something stable and practical. The casual dismissal of what any law professor would recognize as a career-defining opportunity was particularly frustrating. Presenting at Harvard could lead to significant opportunities for my academic career, I said, trying to help her understand the practical implications. Or it could be a lot of pressure that doesn't lead anywhere concrete, Patricia replied. I just worry that you're spending so much time on theoretical work that you're not developing practical skills. The conversation continued in this vein for several more minutes, with Patricia finding ways to introduce doubt and concern into what should have been a celebratory moment. After hanging up, I sat in my Georgetown office feeling frustrated and hurt. Patricia's inability to celebrate even the most objectively impressive achievements had become predictable, but it was still painful. I called Marcus to get his perspective on Patricia's reaction. She did the same thing when I got promoted to senior analyst, he said after I described our conversation. Instead of congratulating me, she immediately started talking about how management positions come with more stress and responsibility. His comment highlighted a pattern I hadn't fully recognized before. Patricia's inability to celebrate achievements wasn't limited to my career. It extended to Marcus as well. Do you think she realizes she's doing it? I asked. Marcus was quiet for a moment. I think she's so focused on maintaining control and feeling needed that she can't risk letting us feel too confident or independent. His analysis was psychologically astute and consistent with what I had observed about Patricia's behavior over the years. Over the next several weeks, as I prepared for my Harvard presentation, I made a conscious decision not to update Patricia on my progress or share any positive feedback I received. The decision felt both liberating and sad. Liberating because it protected me from her undermining comments, but sad because it meant accepting that I couldn't rely on my mother for emotional support during important professional moments. The Harvard presentation itself was everything I had hoped it would be. The faculty workshop was held in a beautiful conference room overlooking Harvard Yard, with about 20 constitutional law professors in attendance. I presented my research on how historical precedent should inform modern constitutional interpretation, building on the work I had done during my Supreme Court clerkship. The questions and comments from the faculty were engaged and thoughtful, suggesting that my research had resonated with the audience. Professor Elizabeth Morrison, one of Harvard's most distinguished constitutional scholars, stayed after the presentation to discuss potential collaboration opportunities. Your approach to precedential analysis is quite innovative, she said as we walked across campus. Have you considered developing this research into a book manuscript? I think it could make a significant contribution to constitutional scholarship, The suggestion was both thrilling and intimidating. Writing a scholarly book was a major undertaking that could establish my reputation in the field, but it also represented a level of academic ambition that I wasn't sure I was ready to embrace. Dean Richardson's approached me before I left Harvard that day. "Nickerson, I wanted to personally thank you for an excellent presentation," he said. "We don't often see such sophisticated constitutional analysis from someone so early in their academic career." He paused, studying me thoughtfully. "I hope you'll keep Harvard in mind as you consider your long-term career plans. We're always looking for scholars who can contribute to constitutional law in meaningful ways." The comment was as close to a job hint as academic administrators typically provided, suggesting that my presentation had made a positive impression on Harvard's leadership. Flying back to Washington that evening, I reflected on how dramatically my professional life had evolved since graduation day. I was teaching at one of the country's top law schools, my research was being recognized by leading constitutional scholars, and I was receiving encouragement from institutions I had only dreamed of joining as a student. When I returned to Georgetown the next day, I found several emails from professors who had heard about my Harvard presentation through academic networks. The positive feedback was overwhelming and validating in ways that I was only beginning to appreciate. Robert Chen from Northwestern sent a particularly meaningful message. "Claire, I heard through colleagues that your presentation at Harvard was exceptional. I'm not surprised your work has always demonstrated exactly the kind of scholarly rigor that makes for significant constitutional scholarship. I hope you're proud of how far you've come since graduation." His message reminded me of the contrast between the academic community's recognition of my potential and Patricia's persistent skepticism. The legal academy seemed to value exactly the qualities that Patricia characterized as impractical or theoretical. That weekend, Daniel visited Washington for the first time since I had started at Georgetown. He was interviewing for fellowship positions at several D.C. hospitals, and we spent Saturday exploring the city and discussing our respective career development. "You seem different," he observed as we walked through Georgetown's campus. "More confident, more settled in your professional identity." His comment made me realize how much my relationship with my career had changed since I had stopped seeking Patricia's validation for my achievement. "I think I'm finally learning to trust my own judgment about my capabilities," I said. "For so long, I let other people's opinions, especially my mom's, influence how I saw my professional potential." Daniel nodded thoughtfully. "It's amazing what happens when you stop trying to convince skeptics and start focusing on people who actually understand and value your work." That evening, as we cooked dinner in my small apartment, Daniel asked about my family's reaction to my academic success. "My dad seems proud, though he doesn't really understand what I do," I said. "Marcus is supportive in his own way, but my mom," I trailed off, unsure how to articulate the complexity of Patricia's responses to my achievements. "She still can't celebrate your success?" Daniel asked gently. "It's worse than that," I said. "She actively works to undermine my confidence. Every achievement gets questioned, every opportunity gets framed as a risk, every bit of recognition gets dismissed as temporary or meaningless." Daniel was quiet for a moment, his medical training evident in how carefully he considered his response. "That sounds like she's threatened by your success rather than proud of it," he said finally. "Some parents have trouble when their children exceed their own achievements, because it highlights their own limitations or choices." His analysis echoed observations that Nicole and Marcus had made, but hearing it from someone with Daniel's clinical perspective made it seem more objective and less like a personal attack on Patricia. Over the following weeks, I found myself paying closer attention to how other people's families responded to their professional achievement. I noticed that most of my Georgetown colleagues spoke about their parents with affection and gratitude, describing how their families celebrated their academic milestones and supported their career choices. Lisa Park, my office neighbor, frequently mentioned how proud her parents were of her legal scholarship despite the fact that neither of them had attended college. Professor Williams often shared stories about his father's enthusiasm for his son's constitutional law research, even though the elder Williams worked in construction and had no legal background. The contrast with my own family dynamic was stark. While these colleagues' parents seemed to trust that their children's professional judgments were sound, Patricia consistently positioned herself as more knowledgeable about my career prospects than I was. In late October, I received an email that would test Patricia's ability to support my success in the most dramatic way possible. The message was from Justice Walsh's chambers, forwarded by her current law clerk. Professor Hoffman, it began, Justice Walsh wanted you to know that she has been approached by the White House counsel's office about potential candidates for a federal judicial nomination. Your name came up in their discussions as someone with exceptional constitutional expertise and judicial temperament. While nothing is certain at this stage, Justice Walsh wanted to give you advance notice that you might be contacted for preliminary discussions about your interest in federal service. I read the email 3 times before its implications fully registered. Federal judicial nominations were among the most prestigious positions in the legal profession, representing the pinnacle of legal careers. The fact that my name was being discussed in such circles less than 2 years after graduating from law school was extraordinary. I immediately called Justice Walsh to thank her and to understand what this development might mean for my career trajectory. Claire, this is entirely preliminary, she cautioned, but the fact that your name is being mentioned in these discussions reflects the impression you've made on people who understand constitutional law at the highest level. She explained that federal judicial nominations involved extensive vetting processes and political considerations that were beyond any candidate's control. However, simply being considered for such positions was a significant professional honor. Regardless of what happens with this particular opportunity, Justice Walsh continued, the fact that you're being discussed for federal service validates everything I've seen in your scholarship and judicial temperament. You should be very proud. After hanging up, I sat in my office, trying to process this development. The possibility of federal judicial service represented a career trajectory I had never seriously considered for myself, yet here it was being presented as a realistic option. That evening, I called Nicole to share this latest development. A federal judgeship, she said, her voice rising with excitement. Claire, do you understand what this means? You're not even 30 years old, and you're being considered for federal judicial service. Her enthusiasm was infectious, but I also felt overwhelmed by the magnitude of what was being suggested. It's just preliminary discussions, I said, trying to maintain perspective. Justice Walsh emphasized that nothing is certain. But the fact that you're being considered at all is extraordinary, Nicole replied. Federal judges are typically chosen from among the most distinguished lawyers and academics in the country. For your name to come up this early in your career means that extremely influential people see exceptional potential in you. After our conversation, I found myself facing a familiar dilemma, whether to share this development with Patricia. The federal judicial possibility was so objectively prestigious that I hoped it might finally prompt a genuinely positive response from her. I decided to call her the next evening, choosing my words carefully to convey both the significance of the opportunity and its preliminary nature. Mom, I wanted to let you know about a development in my career that's quite exciting. What's that, dear? Patricia's tone was already guarded, as if bracing herself for news she might not want to hear. Justice Walsh contacted me to let me know that my name has come up in discussions at the White House counsel's office about potential federal judicial nominations. It's very preliminary, but apparently, people in Washington are aware of my constitutional law work. The silence on the other end of the line stretched so long that I began to wonder if the call had been disconnected. Patricia, are you there? Yes, I'm here, she said finally, her voice strangely flat. I'm just trying to understand what you're telling me. The White House is considering me for a potential federal judgeship, I said, hoping that stating it more directly might prompt a more positive response. Another long pause. When Patricia spoke again, her tone was careful and controlled. Claire, I think you might be getting ahead of yourself. These government positions are very political, and they often don't work out the way people expect. The response was so deflating that I felt physically tired. Even faced with news that any lawyer would recognize as extraordinary, Patricia's first instinct was to introduce caution and skepticism. Justice Walsh seemed to think it was quite significant that my name was being discussed in these circles, I said, trying to convey the professional validation the development represented. Well, of course she would be encouraging, Patricia replied. But you have to remember that these nominations involve politics and connections that you don't necessarily understand. Don't get your hopes up too high. The conversation continued in this familiar pattern, with Patricia finding ways to frame every positive aspect of the development as potentially problematic or misleading. Federal judges also face a lot of scrutiny, she added. Your personal life, your background, everything gets examined. Are you sure you're prepared for that kind of attention? By the time we hung up, I felt demoralized and anxious rather than excited about the opportunity. Patricia had managed to transform news that should have been celebratory into a source of worry and self-doubt. The next day, I called Marcus to get his perspective on Patricia's reaction. She's scared, he said without hesitation after I described our conversation. Scared of what? Scared that you're becoming someone she can't control or criticize, Marcus replied. If you become a federal judge, her opinions about your career choices become completely irrelevant. She can't position herself as more knowledgeable about legal careers than a federal judge. His analysis was illuminating and consistent with the patterns I had observed in Patricia's behavior over the years. I think she's also scared of being left behind, Marcus continued. Your success highlights the limitations of her own choices, and instead of feeling proud, she feels diminished. That weekend I drove to Baltimore to visit Dr. Sarah Kim, a family friend who had known me since childhood. Dr. Kim was a psychologist who had always taken an interest in my academic development, and I trusted her perspective on complex family dynamics. I've been struggling with my mother's reactions to my professional success, I explained as we sat in her comfortable living room. Instead of celebrating my achievements, she consistently finds ways to minimize them or introduce doubt. Kim listened thoughtfully as I described the pattern of Patricia's responses to my law school graduation, Supreme Court clerkship, academic position, Harvard presentation, and potential judicial nomination. What you're describing sounds like a pattern of psychological undermining, she said when I finished. Some parents have difficulty when their children's achievements exceed their own because it threatens their sense of superiority or control. She paused, choosing her words carefully. It's particularly problematic when the undermining becomes systematic and predictable. Healthy parents might occasionally express concern or offer unwanted advice, but they also celebrate their children's successes and trust their judgment. Kim's professional perspective confirmed what I had begun to suspect about Patricia's behavior. What would you recommend? I asked. You need to establish clearer boundaries about what kind of input you're willing to accept, she said. You also need to develop a support network that can provide the encouragement and validation that your mother seems incapable of offering. Her advice was both practical and liberating. I had been so focused on trying to earn Patricia's approval that I hadn't fully appreciated the support I was receiving from mentors, colleagues, and friends who actually understood my field. Over the following weeks, I began implementing Dr. Kim's suggestion. I stopped updating Patricia on professional developments that I knew would trigger her negative responses. I also started paying more attention to the encouragement I was receiving from the legal academic community. Justice Walsh continued to be a source of invaluable guidance and support. When I expressed concerns about whether I was qualified for the level of opportunities I was receiving, her response was characteristically direct. Claire, imposter syndrome is common among high achievers, but it's important not to let it prevent you from recognizing your genuine capability. Your constitutional scholarship is sophisticated and original. Your judicial temperament is evident to everyone who works with you. Trust the judgment of people who understand legal excellence. Professor Morrison from Harvard reached out in November to discuss the book manuscript she had suggested. I've been thinking about our conversation, she wrote in an email, and I believe your research could form the foundation for a significant contribution to constitutional scholarship. Would you be interested in discussing a potential collaboration or mentorship arrangement? The outreach from one of the country's most respected constitutional scholars was both thrilling and intimidating. It represented exactly the kind of academic opportunity I had dreamed of during law school. When I called Justice Walsh to seek her advice about Professor Morrison's suggestion, her enthusiasm was immediate and unqualified. This is exactly the kind of opportunity that could establish your reputation as a constitutional scholar, she said. Professor Morrison doesn't offer mentorship lightly. Her support could open doors throughout your academic career. The contrast between Justice Walsh's excitement about my professional prospects and Patricia's persistent skepticism was becoming impossible to ignore. The legal community seemed to value precisely the qualities that Patricia consistently questioned or dismissed. That evening, I made a decision that felt both scary and liberating. I would stop seeking Patricia's validation for my career choices and start trusting the feedback I was receiving from mentors and colleagues who actually understood constitutional law and legal academia. The decision marked a turning point in how I approached my professional development. Instead of filtering every opportunity through Patricia's lens of skepticism and caution, I began evaluating them based on their potential to advance my scholarly goals and contribute to constitutional understanding. For the first time since graduating from law school, I felt fully confident in my professional trajectory and my ability to make sound career decisions. Patricia's opinions about my choices were becoming irrelevant, replaced by the informed guidance of mentors who recognized and supported my potential. The shift in perspective was profound. Rather than constantly defending my achievements or seeking approval for my ambitions, I was able to focus entirely on the intellectual and professional growth that had drawn me to constitutional law in the first place. As the semester progressed and my scholarly work continued to receive recognition, I realized that Patricia's inability to celebrate my success was not a reflection of my achievement's value but rather a limitation of her own psychology and perspective. The recognition felt both painful and empowering. Painful because it meant accepting that my mother might never be able to support my professional growth, but empowering because it freed me to pursue opportunities based on their merit, rather than their likelihood of earning Patricia's approval. Standing in my Georgetown office one December afternoon, looking at the framed invitation from Harvard and the preliminary correspondence about federal judicial service, I finally understood what Justice Walsh had meant when she said I should trust my own judgment. My law degree hadn't been worthless. It had been the foundation for everything I was building. Patricia's inability to see that was her limitation, not mine. The call came on a crisp January morning while I was preparing for my constitutional law seminar at Georgetown. The caller identified himself as Deputy White House Counsel Michael Rodriguez, and his voice carried the weight of official business. Professor Hoffman, I'm calling to formally invite you to meet with our team regarding potential federal judicial service. We've been impressed by your scholarly work and the recommendations we've received from Justice Walsh and others in the legal community. The conversation lasted 20 minutes, during which we discussed the vetting process, the timeline for nominations, and my availability for preliminary interviews. By the time I hung up, my hands were trembling with excitement and disbelief. At 29 years old, I was being seriously considered for a lifetime appointment to the federal bench. The possibilities still seemed surreal, but the formal nature of the White House outreach made it undeniably real. I immediately called Justice Walsh to share the development and seek her guidance on the interview process. "Claire, this is extraordinary," she said, her voice warm with pride. "The fact that you're receiving this level of consideration at your age speaks to the exceptional impression you've made on the legal community." She spent the next hour coaching me on what to expect during the White House interviews, the types of questions I might encounter, and how to present my judicial philosophy effectively. "Remember," she concluded, "they're not just evaluating your legal knowledge, they're assessing your temperament, your judgment, and your ability to serve with integrity and fairness. Based on everything I've observed about your character and capabilities, I have complete confidence in your suitability for federal service." That evening I called Daniel to share the news. He was completing his final month of residency in Minneapolis, and we had been planning his move to Washington, where he had secured a fellowship position at Georgetown University Hospital, a federal judgeship, he said, awe evident in his voice. "Claire, this is beyond anything we could have imagined when you were struggling with job applications after graduation." His reminder of that difficult period made the current opportunity seem even more remarkable. In less than 2 years, I had gone from questioning my professional prospects to being considered for one of the most prestigious positions in American law. Are you going to tell your family? Daniel asked. The question gave me pause. I had largely stopped updating Patricia on professional developments, but a potential federal judgeship seemed too significant to keep private. I think I have to, I said. This is the kind of news that would be strange not to share. That weekend, I drove to Portland for what I had planned as a brief family visit. I wanted to share the judicial nomination news in person, hoping that perhaps the magnitude of the opportunity would finally prompt a genuinely supportive response from Patricia. The conversation took place in my parents' living room on Sunday afternoon. My father was reading the newspaper while Patricia organized photo albums on the coffee table. Marcus and his girlfriend Sarah had joined us for dinner, creating what felt like an appropriate family setting for significant news. I have something important to share with everyone, I began, setting down my coffee cup and looking around the room. Patricia glanced up from her photo albums, her expression already guarded in the way that had become familiar whenever I mentioned professional developments. The White House has formally invited me to interview for a federal judicial nomination, I said, watching their faces carefully. Deputy White House counsel called this week to begin the vetting process for a potential lifetime appointment to the federal bench. My father's newspaper dropped to his lap, his eyes wide with surprise and what appeared to be pride. A federal judge? He said slowly. Claire, that's incredible. How did this happen? I explained Justice Walsh's recommendation, the recognition my constitutional scholarship had received, and the preliminary discussions that had led to formal White House consideration. Marcus and Sarah were both smiling broadly, asking detailed questions about the process and timeline. My father seemed genuinely amazed, repeatedly expressing his pride in my achievement. Patricia's reaction was notably different. She continued organizing photographs, her movements deliberate and controlled, as if the conversation were happening around her rather than including her. Patricia, my father said finally, did you hear what Claire said? She's being considered for a federal judgeship. Patricia looked up with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Yes, I heard. It sounds very preliminary. The dismissive tone was exactly what I had expected, but still stung. Even faced with news that would impress any reasonable person, Patricia's first instinct was to minimize its significance. It's actually quite advanced, I said carefully. The White House doesn't begin formal vetting unless they're seriously considering nomination. Patricia's smile became strained. Well, these political appointments can be very unpredictable. I wouldn't want you to get your hopes up too high. The familiar pattern was playing out exactly as I had anticipated, but this time I felt more prepared to respond directly. It's not really a political appointment in the traditional sense, I said. Federal judges receive lifetime tenure specifically to insulate them from political pressure. Patricia's expression tightened slightly. Claire, I think you might be underestimating how these things work. Government positions involve politics and connections that you might not fully understand. Marcus looked uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation. Mom, this is really exciting news. Can't we just celebrate Claire's achievement? Patricia's response was swift and sharp. Of course I'm happy for Claire. I just want her to be realistic about government work and not get carried away by titles and prestige. The comment revealed everything I had come to understand about Patricia's psychology. She framed her undermining as protection while positioning herself as more knowledgeable about professional realities than I was. I think Claire probably understands her field better than any of us, my father said gently, his discomfort with Patricia's response evident. The remainder of the visit was awkward, with Patricia maintaining polite conversation while studiously avoiding any further discussion of my judicial prospects. By the time I left Portland that evening, I felt emotionally drained and frustrated. Driving back to the airport, I called Nicole to process what had happened. She can't do it, Nicole said after I described the family conversation. Even when faced with the most objectively impressive achievement imaginable, she still can't celebrate your success. Nicole's observation was both painful and clarifying. Patricia's inability to support my professional growth wasn't situational or based on legitimate concerns. It was fundamental to how she related to my achievement. I think this might be the last time I share professional news with her, I said. That's probably healthy, Nicole replied. You deserve to have your achievements celebrated, not constantly questioned and minimized. The White House interviews took place over several days in February. The process was intensive and thorough, involving meetings with senior administration officials, discussions of my judicial philosophy, and detailed reviews of my scholarly work and professional background. Justice Walsh had prepared me well for the experience. The questions were probing but fair, focusing on my approach to constitutional interpretation, my understanding of judicial restraint, and my views on the proper role of federal courts in American democracy. Deputy Counsel Rodriguez conducted the final interview, a 2-hour conversation that ranged from specific legal doctrines to broader questions about judicial temperament and ethics. "Professor Hoffman," he said as our meeting concluded, "I want you to know that we've been consistently impressed by your scholarship, your professional demeanor, and the recommendations we've received from colleagues across the legal spectrum." He explained that the final selection process would take several more weeks, but indicated that I should remain optimistic about the outcome. "Regardless of the ultimate decision," he added, "you should be proud that your work has brought you to this level of consideration. Very few lawyers ever reach this point in the nomination process." Flying back to Washington that evening, I reflected on how dramatically my life had changed since Patricia's dismissive comments at law school graduation. The worthless piece of paper she had mocked had become the foundation for recognition at the highest levels of American government. When I returned to Georgetown the next day, Dean Williams called me into his office. "Claire, I hope you know how proud the law school is of your achievements," he said. "Having a faculty member under consideration for federal judicial service reflects extraordinarily well on our constitutional law program." He explained that word of my nomination process had spread through academic networks, generating significant positive attention for Georgetown's scholarship and faculty development. "Whatever happens with the nomination," he continued, "your work has already established you as one of the rising stars in constitutional law. The school is committed to supporting your continued success here." The conversation reinforced my growing confidence in my professional trajectory and the value of my scholarly work. The legal academic community seemed unanimous in recognizing the significance of my achievements, providing a stark contrast to Patricia's persistent skepticism. 3 weeks later, Deputy Counsel Rodriguez called with the news I had been hoping to hear. "Professor Hoffman, I'm pleased to inform you that the President has decided to nominate you for the United States District Court for the District of Columbia. Congratulations, you'll be making history as one of the youngest federal judges ever nominated." The formal announcement would come the following week, followed by Senate confirmation hearings and hopefully a floor vote. The entire process would likely take several months, but the nomination itself represented the culmination of everything I had worked toward. I called Justice Walsh immediately after hanging up with the White House. "Claire, this is absolutely wonderful," she said, her voice filled with emotion. "You've demonstrated that excellence in constitutional scholarship and judicial temperament can be recognized and rewarded, regardless of age or traditional career paths." She paused, and I could hear the smile in her voice. "I hope you're proud of what you've accomplished. You've proven that your law degree was anything but worthless." That evening, Daniel and I celebrated with dinner at our favorite restaurant in Georgetown. He had officially moved to Washington the month before, and we were finally building a life together in the same city. "Federal Judge Hoffman," he said, raising his wine glass in a toast. "I love the sound of that." The title still felt surreal, but the formal nomination made it tangible in a way that previous possibilities hadn't. "I keep thinking about graduation day," I admit. "When my mom called my degree worthless, I actually believed her for a while. Now that same degree has led to a federal judgeship." Daniel reached across the table and took my hand. "Your mom was wrong about everything: your capabilities, your prospects, the value of your education. The legal community has recognized what she couldn't see." The next morning, I faced a decision about whether to call Patricia with the nomination news. Part of me hoped that a presidential nomination might finally prompt genuine pride and support. Another part of me dreaded another disappointing conversation. I ultimately decided to call, reasoning that she would learn about the nomination through news coverage anyway. "Mom, I wanted to let you know that the president has formally nominated me for a federal judgeship. The announcement will be public tomorrow." The silence on the other end of the line stretched longer than usual. "I see," Patricia said finally, her voice carefully controlled. That's quite unexpected. The response was so underwhelming that I felt almost sorry for her. Faced with news that any parent would normally celebrate with joy and pride, Patricia could only manage surprised neutrality. The Senate confirmation process will take several months, I continued, but the nomination itself is a significant honor. Yes, I'm sure it is, Patricia replied, her tone suggesting polite disinterest rather than maternal pride. These government appointments involve a lot of scrutiny, though. Are you prepared for that level of public attention? Even in the face of a presidential nomination, Patricia's instinct was to introduce concern and caution rather than celebration. I think I'm prepared, I said simply, no longer willing to defend my capabilities or readiness. The conversation ended with perfunctory congratulations that felt more obligatory than genuine. After hanging up, I realized that I felt more relieved than disappointed. Patricia's inability to celebrate my achievements had become so predictable that her lackluster response confirmed rather than surprised me. The public announcement of my nomination generated significant media attention. Legal publications praised the president's choice, describing me as a brilliant young constitutional scholar whose work had impressed Supreme Court justices and academic colleagues alike. The Washington Post ran a profile piece that traced my path from Northwestern Law School through my Supreme Court clerkship to Georgetown and ultimately to federal nomination. The article included quotes from Justice Walsh, Professor Morrison from Harvard, and Dean Williams, all emphasizing my intellectual rigor and judicial temperament. Professor Hoffman represents exactly the kind of legal mind that should serve on the federal bench, Justice Walsh was quoted as saying. Her scholarship demonstrates deep, constitutional understanding combined with practical wisdom about the proper role of courts in our democratic system. Nicole called after reading the coverage online. Claire, you're all over legal Twitter. People are calling this one of the most impressive judicial nominations in recent memory. The widespread positive response from the legal community was gratifying and validating. Constitutional law professors, practicing attorneys, and judicial clerks all seemed to recognize the significance of my nomination and the qualifications that had led to it. Marcus sent a text that afternoon. Saw the news cover. Dad is so proud. He's been showing the articles to everyone at work. Mom, well, you know, Mom. His message was both touching and sadly accurate. While my father seemed genuinely thrilled by the recognition I was receiving, Patricia remained unable to participate in the celebration. The Senate confirmation hearings took place in April after months of preparation and vetting. The process was thorough but respectful, with senators from both parties asking detailed questions about my judicial philosophy, constitutional interpretation, and approach to legal precedent. Senator Elizabeth Torres from California was particularly supportive during the hearings. Judge nominee Hoffman, she said during her questioning period, your scholarship on constitutional precedent has been praised by legal experts across the political spectrum. How do you believe this academic foundation will inform your service on the federal bench? I explained how my research had reinforced my commitment to careful legal reasoning, respect for precedent, and the importance of judicial restraint in constitutional interpretation. The role of a federal judge is to interpret and apply the law fairly and consistently, I said, regardless of personal preferences or political considerations. My academic work has deepened my appreciation for these principles. The hearing concluded with positive statements from committee members and broad agreement that my qualifications were exceptional. The committee vote was unanimous in favor of confirmation, and the full Senate vote was scheduled for the following month. Justice Walsh attended the Senate vote, sitting in the gallery as the chamber confirmed my nomination by a margin of 87-13. The overwhelming bipartisan support reflected the legal community's consensus about my qualifications and character. After the vote, Justice Walsh joined me for dinner at a restaurant near the Capitol. Claire, I hope you understand what you've accomplished, she said as we celebrated with champagne. You've proven that excellence can be recognized and rewarded, regardless of age or traditional expectation. She raised her glass in a toast. To Judge Hoffman, may your service on the federal bench be as distinguished as your path to it has been. The investiture ceremony took place in June at the federal courthouse in Washington. The large courtroom was filled with colleagues from Georgetown, former classmates from Northwestern, Supreme Court staff and family members. My father had flown in from Portland, his pride evident as he watched the proceeding. Marcus attended with Sarah, both of them beaming throughout the ceremony. Daniel sat in the front row, having taken the day off from his fellowship to be present for this milestone. Patricia had also made the trip to Washington, though her presence felt more obligatory than celebratory. She sat with my father, maintaining appropriate expressions while somehow managing to convey emotional distance. Chief Judge Martinez administered the oath of office, reading the traditional words that would formally invest me with federal judicial authority. Do you solemnly swear that you will administer justice without respect to persons, and do equal right to the poor and to the rich, and that you will faithfully and impartially discharge and perform all the duties incumbent upon you as United States District Judge, according to the best of your abilities and understanding, agreeably to the Constitution and laws of the United States? I do, I said, my voice steady despite the magnitude of the moment. The ceremony concluded with remarks from Chief Judge Martinez about my qualifications and the significance of my appointment. He noted that I was the youngest federal judge currently serving and praised my exceptional constitutional scholarship and demonstrated judicial temperament. At the reception following the ceremony, colleagues and friends offered congratulations and shared their excitement about my appointment. Justice Walsh spoke eloquently about my journey from law student to federal judge, emphasizing the hard work and intellectual rigor that had made this achievement possible. Judge Hoffman's path to the federal bench demonstrates that excellence will ultimately be recognized, she said to the assembled guests. Her constitutional scholarship has already influenced important legal decisions, and I have no doubt that her judicial service will continue to strengthen our legal system. During the reception, I noticed Patricia standing apart from the crowd, observing the proceedings with an expression I couldn't quite read. When I approached her, she offered polite congratulations that felt rehearsed rather than heartfelt. It's certainly an impressive ceremony, she said, her tone suggesting she was commenting on a performance rather than celebrating her daughter's achievement. Thank you for coming, I replied, genuinely meaning it despite her emotional distance. Of course, Patricia, I wouldn't miss such an important day, but even in that moment of triumph, surrounded by recognition and celebration, I felt the familiar absence of maternal pride and support. Patricia's presence was physical but not emotional, formal but not warm. Later that evening, as Daniel and I reflected on the day's events in our apartment, I realized that Patricia's inability to celebrate my success no longer caused me the pain it once had. You've built something extraordinary, Daniel said as we sat together on our couch, my judicial commission framed on the coffee table before us. From law school graduation to federal judge in less than 4 years, it's been incredible to witness. I thought about the journey he was describing, from Patricia's dismissive comments about my worthless degree to this moment of unprecedented professional achievement. The funny thing is, I said, she was completely wrong about everything. My law degree wasn't worthless, it was the foundation for everything that followed. My academic work wasn't impractical, it caught the attention of Supreme Court justices and White House officials. My career choices weren't naive, they were exactly right for my abilities and aspirations. Daniel nodded thoughtfully. Sometimes the people who claim to know us best are actually the least capable of seeing our true potential. 6 months into my tenure as a federal judge, I received a letter that surprised me. It was from a first-year law student at a small school in Oregon who had read about my path to the federal bench. Judge Hoffman, the letter began, I wanted to thank you for showing that it's possible to achieve extraordinary things in the legal profession, even when people close to you doubt your potential. My family doesn't understand why I'm pursuing law school, and they often make comments, similar to what I've read your mother said about your degree being worthless. Your success gives me hope that I can prove them wrong too. The letter reminded me that my story wasn't just about personal achievement, it was about the broader message that excellence will ultimately be recognized, regardless of the skepticism we encounter along the way. That evening, I drafted a response to the student, sharing some of the lessons I had learned about trusting my own judgment and finding mentors who understood and supported my professional goals. The most important thing I've learned, I wrote, is that you cannot allow other people's limitations to become your own. Your law degree has value because you will give it value through your work, your integrity, and your commitment to just trust your abilities, seek guidance from people who understand your field, and remember that the skeptics' voices will fade as your achievements speak for themselves. Sitting in my federal chambers that night, looking at the law degree that now hung alongside my judicial commission, I finally understood what Justice Walsh had meant years earlier when she said I should trust my own judgment. Patricia had been wrong about everything: the value of my education, the significance of my achievements, and my potential for success in the legal profession. Her inability to recognize my capabilities said more about her own limitations than about my prospects. The law degree she had dismissed as worthless had become the foundation for constitutional scholarship, Supreme Court recognition, and ultimately federal judicial service. Every step of that journey had validated my decision to pursue legal education and to trust my intellectual instincts over her persistent skepticism. As I prepared for another day on the federal bench, I felt grateful for the mentors who had seen my potential when my own mother could not. Justice Walsh, Professor Morrison, Dean Williams, and countless others had provided the encouragement and guidance that had made this journey possible. Most importantly, I had learned to trust my own judgment about my capabilities and career trajectory. Patricia's opinions about my professional choices had become irrelevant, replaced by the informed recognition of colleagues who understood constitutional law and judicial excellence. The girl who had stood in that graduation tent, crushed by her mother's dismissive words about her worthless law degree, had become Judge Hoffman, confirmed by the United States Senate to serve with lifetime tenure on the federal bench. Sometimes the greatest victory is not winning others' approval, but learning that you never needed it in the first place. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.